Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in from truly across the continent today for another exciting Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants broadcast. My name is Jesse. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And you're catching us on an exciting day because A, we're doing a huge slew of broadcasts. We started off earlier today with belugas, we've got squid, we just wrapped up with cougars, and we're going to do our final program of the day today on coral reefs. But we're also doing an epic series. This is our part 4 of 5, our penultimate broadcast in the Our World Underwater Scholarship Society series. This is a 5-part series featuring some of their incredible past laureates. Now, the Our World Underwater Scholarship Society has been going for 50 years, finding the best young ocean advocates, scientists, storytellers, and giving them amazing career opportunities, networking, and more to sort of springboard them into the world of ocean storytelling and conservation. And we've been featuring their alumni over the last few months. It has been such an incredible ride. You can catch all those programs on our YouTube channel. And a big thank you to them, the Story Collider, and the Rolex Perpetual Planet Initiative for making this series possible. Before we dive in with our speaker, I want to note we do have a Kahoot today. So if you want to play along with a little 4-question quiz between our talk and our Q&A, test your understanding, have a little bit of fun, that is the game pin. I will bring that up again before we go live. Now, I'm so thrilled today to welcome in Mykle Hoban. He is a molecular ecologist who gets to study one of the coolest and most remote ecosystems on this planet, which is deep water coral reef ecosystems. He gets to go down and just explore them, but also use DNA and other modern biotechnology tools to understand these special places, which, again, is something that we barely ever featured here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So I'm really excited to literally and figuratively dive in with him, take you on a little bit of journey beneath the waves. And without further ado, Mykle, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the broadcast.
Thanks so much, Jesse. Thanks for the hype music to get me ready. Good morning from Hawaii, where it's a little earlier than it is for maybe most of you, but let me get my presentation up and running.
Yeah, as we're pulling that up, not only is the hype music great, but we are so far apart. I'm in Newfoundland, so I'm in a very different island from you. I think I'm literally closer to like Egypt than I am to you right now, which is pretty exciting.
I think you might be.
Yeah, it's a pretty wide swath, and thank you for getting up early. You have your presentation up, and you're good to go, man.
Beauty. Well, like I said, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. As you said, I'm Mykle Hoban. And I want to talk to you about a little bit about some of the stuff that I do. I was for the Our World Underwater Scholarship Society, I was an intern for them in their scientific diving internship way back in 2010, which is maybe before a lot of you were born, but and I was the very first one of those. And that experience kind of really set me on the path that I'm on today. So let me tell you about that. So I am very lucky to get to work at this place. This is the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology on the island of Mokuolo'e, which is its own small island next to the island of Oahu, which is where Honolulu is, the sort of capital of the state of Hawaii. And the whole island is basically a marine biology research lab. And it's great because it's essentially built on top of the place where most of us study and work. So it's a really cool and unique environment, and I'm very fortunate to get to work there. But so I wanted to start this off by sort of asking this question: what is a coral reef, right? So not everybody has heard of these things, and I want to tell you about them a little bit. So these coral reefs are these really sort of magical environments that we find in tropical ocean waters, kind of across the world. So you find them in the Caribbean, you find them in the Pacific, you find them in the Indian Ocean, wherever the water is warm and there's lots of sunlight, essentially. And they're called coral reefs because they're largely made up of these animals. So these very colorful kind of stony things that you see here are the animals called corals. And they're not plants, they're not rocks, they're animals. And a very important thing that these corals do is, much like plants, they can use sunlight to kind of create their food and energy. So that will become important a little bit later. So, and then the coral reef is just the environment built up by these corals, and then all of the other hundreds and thousands of little critters that tend to live all throughout them. But so if you ever do think about coral reefs, which I'm not sure if you do, I wonder if maybe some of the things you might think of are, scenes kind of like this, sort of well-lit, bright scenes, colorful fish, beautiful, colorful, upright corals, maybe Nemo, maybe Nemo's cousin. But these scenes that I showed you all have one thing in common. And that thing is that they are all in essentially quite shallow water. This is just a diagram of sort of the edge of an island and the bottom dropping off. And so the vast majority of coral reefs that we have studied are in the top maybe 100 feet of water or so. But there is this whole other realm. So this is an old diagram, but I really like it because it shows kind of the main kind of crux of the idea. So if you look at this, this is another diagram of a slope down the side of an island or something like that. So on the top here, we have the top 120 feet or so of water. And this coral reef has been studied quite a lot, mostly using scuba diving. If we go all the way down below 500 feet, surprisingly, this area has been studied quite a lot too, using things like submarines and robots and so forth. But there's this middle zone in this kind of 120 to around 500-foot area that we really don't know as much about. And this is kind of where I get really excited. And so we may know more about the ocean floor than we know about the coral reef twilight zone. This term twilight zone is not really used anymore to describe this area. We call it mesophotic coral ecosystems, but I'm just going to call them deep reefs. But so this is kind of the video that started it all for me. This is a really small snippet of a much longer video, but it's essentially two guys that are very excited about diving very deep. They're about 450 feet here. One of them is a man named Richard Pyle, who's very famous for kind of starting this work. And I wish you could hear it, because one of the things about diving very deep is you actually have to use helium. So when he says, "I'm going to get you on video, little guy," he says, "I'm going to get you on video, little guy." But anyway, you'll have to just take my word for it. So I saw this video while I was working as that intern, the Our World Underwater Scholarship Society intern, and it got me really thinking about all of this stuff. But so how do we study these things, right? And it's a fairly new area of study, but at the same time, it's been going on for a very long time. So in the old days, 150, 200 years ago, and I'm sure this goes back hundreds of thousands of years, because people have been living next to coral reefs as long as there have been people, and people have been trying to understand them in all sorts of different ways. But in terms of sort of modern Western science, 150, 200 years ago, back to the days of Charles Darwin, they would study these things by essentially dropping a bucket off the side of a ship, dragging it on the bottom and pulling it up and seeing what comes up. And so that's a great way to get a first glimpse, but you really don't understand what's happening in the place itself. So if you fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, scuba diving came along. And this was an absolute revolution. This changed marine biology, marine science. People were able to get down into the environment and experience it firsthand. And so this was huge. And so even back to then, people were trying to, push the limits, get a little bit deeper when they could. But mostly this scuba was limited to kind of fairly shallow waters, because you have that small tank on your back that only lasts maybe an hour or so if you're lucky. And of course, diving deep can be tricky. So this is a little bit technical, but essentially the idea is that if you dive deep and you come up quick, you can get into trouble. And it's because of the way the gas you're breathing dissolves into your blood. But essentially, if you come up too quickly, it can be harmful, and you can get something called the bends, which the best analogy I can give you is it's sort of like if you shake up a soda and then open it, but it happens inside your body, and you don't want that to happen. So there's other ways, obviously, to get down to these areas. Like I mentioned before, we have these robots, or ROVs. We have submersible submarines. And these things are absolutely fantastic tools. But for this kind of environment where you're trying to get up close and personal, and maybe there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of things sticking out and a lot of holes and caves, these things can be a little clumsy. And of course, you also need a big ship to operate these things, and they cost a ton of money. And so, it's hard to get big ships in close to the edges of islands where a lot of these kinds of things are. So in the 80s and 90s, something called technical diving was developed. And I know a couple of the previous speakers have kind of touched on this very briefly. And these are cartoonishly extreme examples. But the idea of technical diving is that people discovered that if you go down deep, but you come up very slowly, you can actually do it relatively safely. But the problem is with scuba diving, and I'll describe why in a minute, you need to bring a lot of tanks with you because you need a lot of basically air to breathe to stay down long enough to be able to come up slow enough, if that makes sense. So technical diving is great. It allows you to access a lot of these things, but you're somewhat limited in terms of the amount of time that you can spend, and you have all this stuff attached to you. So along came this technology called rebreathers, and this is a fairly new diving technology, but the technology itself goes all the way back to the 19th century. These devices were developed for miners to escape coal mines, when there was a gas disaster or something like that. And so this is the tool that I use, and these are really exciting. It's a really exciting bit of tech because what it does, is it allows you, and I'll describe exactly how that does in a second, but it allows you to spend longer period of time underwater. It allows you to sometimes come up maybe not quite as slowly, so you don't have to spend as much time in the water doing things that aren't research. And really critically for some areas of study, there are no bubbles, which is really exciting, and I'll explain why in a sec. So if you think about regular scuba diving, maybe you've done it, maybe you've seen it on TV or something like that, but these guys are swimming around underwater, and when they exhale, bubbles come out, right? The gas that they breathe out just goes out into the water. With a rebreather, as the name probably suggests, they actually recycle your breath. And so this is a kind of a cartoon of one of these. If you look on the right side of this loop, right where the red and the blue meet, that's where your mouth goes, and so you're breathing in there. And so when you inhale, you get whatever your breathing gas is, which when you're diving deep often has a lot of helium in it for some fairly complex reasons, but you end up breathing a lot of helium, and it makes you sound very funny when you talk to each other. But so you inhale this helium, and a little bit of oxygen, which you need obviously to live, comes in, and you inhale it. When you exhale, rather than it going back out into the water, it goes back through into the system. And on the left side here, where all those little white blobs are, that is a chemical. And what the chemical does is it takes the carbon dioxide out of your breath. I don't know if you've ever breathed into a paper bag. I don't recommend it, but you'll get a headache. And that's because when you breathe out, there's carbon dioxide. And so we have to get rid of that. And so that's what this chemical does. So when you breathe out, your breath goes through that chemical. The carbon dioxide essentially is absorbed into that chemical. And then this is sort of happening all the time, but you have computers and you have sensors that are monitoring the amount of oxygen that you have, and adding a little bit at a time to make sure you always have exactly the amount of oxygen that you need to breathe. And then this goes back through the loop, and it just keeps going and going and going. And so this is really great because there are no bubbles, which makes a huge difference when you're trying to study fish. They literally will swim into you rather than trying to swim away from you. And of course, it allows you to stay a longer period of time. If you remember the photos of me on a rebreather, I still had a lot of extra gear. You still have to carry some extra gear for safety, but it's nowhere near what you would if you were trying to do technical diving on regular scuba. So what's going on down on these deeper reefs? So they're deep coral reefs. So obviously there's corals. So this is a photograph from Hawaii, where I live, in a place called the Au Channel. And we have these incredible, this is maybe about 250 feet deep, these incredibly large fields of this one species of coral that can extend just all over the place. And it's quite spectacular. This is just another little view of the same thing. I think this picture was taken using a robot. And one of the interesting things that happens to corals, because most of the corals that we know of are in the shallow, but when you go a little deeper, I told you before that corals use light to make energy, much like plants and trees and so forth do. And one thing that interestingly that happens is when you go deeper, some of the corals will get sort of squashed down and flat. And so this is two pictures of the same kind of coral. And you can see the one on the right is a little smashed down. And they do that because they want to stretch out sideways so they can collect as much sunlight as they can so they can get the energy that they need. And these ones that I showed before, these ones only live in deeper water. So they're always stretched out and flat like this. This is an extreme example. So on the left, that sort of orangey, spiky business is one kind of coral. And on the right, that sort of gray-green coral is the same species, the same kind of coral. So you can see sometimes when you go, and the left is maybe in 10 feet, 3 meters of water. And on the right, it's maybe 300 feet, 90 meters of water or so. And so you can see there's quite a dramatic change. We have all sorts of other stuff down there that are not just corals. So in Hawaii, we have areas with lots of seaweed. So on the left, this is a big field of a little upright seaweed that's quite common here in Hawaii. On the right is a sponge. We don't tend to have a ton of big sponges like this in the Pacific, but this one is from Hawaii. In the Caribbean, sponges get really important when you go down onto deep reefs. And so sometimes you can see these changes in what is the dominant thing on the bottom. There's also other things. These things are called black corals. And so this diver in these photos is me. And there's no perspective trick here. I'm fairly close to those big bushy things. And so you can see they're very large relative to me. And these are something called black corals. And they're these big bushy tree-like things, also animals, not plants. And they like to hang out in areas where there's lots of water current. So when the water rushes past very fast, it carries lots of food into their thousands of tiny mouths. And so in this area, I'm hovering a little bit above the bottom, and I'm okay there. But if I was to go any higher above the bottom, the current would have just swept me away. But this is a fairly spectacular thing. And we have a lot of these big black corals in Hawaii, but you can find them all over. And then this is another common thing, especially in the Pacific, as you go over towards places like Indonesia, these gorgonians or sea fans. And these things also, as you can see on the right, get very large. And so these things become very common on deeper reefs. Of course, we also have fishes. And this is ultimately my true love, is deep reef fishes. And so these, you can see, are spectacular kinds of fish. And these are all fishes that occur only in Hawaii. You may think, why am I saying fishes? May sound a little funny. So we have the words fishes and fish have specific meanings. So obviously a fish is one fish. Two fish of the same kind are two fish. If you have multiple fishes of different kinds, then we use the word fishes. So that's why I say that on this slide. So these things all occur only in Hawaii and nowhere else, which may not be that interesting to you if you don't really think about where Hawaii is situated, but it's a small island group out in the big ocean. And many of the things in the Pacific Ocean especially are found all across the Pacific. And so these ones are especially only in Hawaii. And they're all quite beautiful. This one is my favorite. It's a guy called a Tinker's butterfly fish, and again, found only in Hawaii. And there are one exciting things about deep reefs is that there are many new species of fish to be. I mean, there's probably more species of things that are not fish to be discovered, but there are many new species to discover, especially of fishes on deep reefs. And so these are three groups of fishes that had been described as new to science just in the last 4 years. I wasn't involved in these projects, but these are examples of the kinds of new discoveries that are waiting to be made. And you think it's actually quite exciting because you may think fish are quite big and they're vertebrates and you see them all over the place. So to describe a whole new species of fish is a quite exciting occasion. And I've been fortunate to describe one species, and I'm working on a couple more. But the one so far that I have described was actually surprisingly from a shallow reef. So it's not included in this presentation. And as I said, many of these deep reef species are found nowhere else. And so this is a video from maybe about 250 feet, 60, 70 meters, also in Hawaii. And you can see some of the fish that I showed you 2 slides ago on here. But again, this video, every fish in this video only lives in Hawaii, which is a surprising thing. There are not many places in the world where you can drop down underwater, pop on a video camera, and everything that you see only lives in the place where you are. So this is something that's quite special about Hawaii, but it is something that happens more on deeper reefs. But sometimes there's a surprise. So this is a beautiful thing called the peppermint angelfish, and it lives only on very deep reefs, 250, 300 feet or more. And for the longest time, so this is a map of the whole Pacific Ocean. You can see there's islands absolutely everywhere. If you look all the way up in the top right, you'll see Hawaii, where I am, and you'll see that it's actually far away from most of the other islands. And so which may explain why we have more species in Hawaii that don't occur anywhere else. But for the longest time, this peppermint angelfish was only known from this spot here, the Cook Islands. And so we thought that it only lived there. And so the term we used to describe that as endemic, we thought it was endemic to the Cook Islands. But it turned out it was also over here in Tahiti, which may not look very far away, but it's interesting when, for years and years and years, we only see something in one place and then it shows up somewhere else. And so this really underlines the amount of discovery that it's there to be made on these deeper reefs. So you may have heard about shallow coral reefs or coral reefs in general as kind of being in trouble, under threat. And there's a lot of threats. Climate change is a big problem, pollution, overfishing, all of this. But deep reefs are deep. So are they in the same kind of trouble? Are they safe? And I'll give you a little hint. Oftentimes when somebody gives you a headline with a question mark, the answer is no. So in this case, these are all photographs of very deep reefs, and you can see on these two, I know they're small, but on these little guys here, these are evidence of hurricane damage all the way down at 350 feet. This is sediment, sand, and mud kind of dumped down from shallow reefs that can smother that habitat. Trash. Coral bleaching is a thing that happens. It's quite complex. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but essentially it's a thing that happens to corals when the water is too hot. And it can be very damaging to them. And so this is a coral undergoing that bleaching process way down 350 feet or so. And then this is a hard to see photograph, but it's a picture of a lionfish in a place where a lionfish should not be, which is in the Caribbean. And they're all over, but they're also down deep as well. And so these are all of the same kinds of problems that shallow reefs have, but they affect deeper reefs in unique ways. And so the answer is there may be some cases where they are safer, but by and large, they are also threatened, and they have not been paid as much attention to. And I think that they should be lumped together. I mean, they require different approaches, but they're all part of the same ecosystem, right? And so they all deserve protection. But reefs, shallow and deep reefs, are more than just fishes and corals. Fishes are my love, but also biodiversity, right? What's out there? What are all of the things that live out there? And so there's way more of everything else on a reef than there are fishes. So, but one problem with these is that they are hard to find. They are hard to count. They are small. They live under rocks. They may be hidden, and they may be hard to identify. So some of my research that I've been doing lately uses DNA technology called environmental DNA, which essentially, there's a whole process to it, but essentially you can take seawater, you can scoop up some water, and you can analyze that water, and it will actually tell you what has been swimming around in that water recently. And it uses DNA. And so DNA is a chemical that every living thing has inside of it that essentially describes what that living thing is. And if we can access that, we can use it like a barcode. So kind of like if you go to the supermarket and you buy a candy bar and they beep the barcode and the computer knows it's a candy bar. We can use DNA in the same way to identify a species. For environment, so usually you have to have the animal and take a little bit of DNA. But in environmental DNA, what can happen is that when animals swim around in the water, bits of them fall off into the water. If it's mucus, or if it's scales in the case of fishes, even poop, those kinds of things all have DNA in them, and they all kind of get out into the water and float around. So if we take the water, we can look at the DNA just in the water, and it will tell us, we can use that as a barcode, and it will tell us what animals were in there without actually having to look directly at the animals themselves. It's a very exciting technology. So I was very interested in looking at, and I'm expanding this work soon to kind of go across the Pacific. But the question is, can we detect differences between deep and shallow reefs using this environmental DNA or eDNA technology? Because this may sound like a very fundamental question, but it's still something that we're trying to figure out, is how different are these things, right? Especially in Hawaii, where we've had a lot of work on these, but most of it has focused on corals and fish. And so, but there's all this other stuff out there. So we want to know what's going on with that. And so what we did is so this is a map. Up in the top left is all of the main Hawaiian islands where people live. this big, in the main part of the map is the big island. And then those are where we went and looked. And what we did is we went diving down to 300 feet, 90 meters, and we took seawater every 50 feet or so, every 15 meters from the surface down to that depth at all of these different locations. And then we analyzed it for the DNA to see, okay, what is in there and what patterns can we find? And so this is, here I am getting ready to go down for an exciting bout of water collection. And here I am kicking down the slope, trying to go down and collect. And if you look closely, hanging off the right side of me, you can see all those clear plastic tubes, and that's what we were using to collect the seawater. And you can see, you may notice as I'm swimming along, no bubbles. So what did we find? Well, we were interested in most everything else, but we looked at fish too. So the first thing we noticed is that when we looked at the fish, we did not see any obvious pattern. They were just kind of spread around, which was not a big surprise to us, but it was interesting to see the DNA say that as well. And if you think about fish are swimming around a lot, they're moving up and down. And so maybe they don't have such a distinct pattern, shallow and deep, although there's some exceptions to that. But so this is where it got exciting, is when we looked at everything else. So these are the invertebrates, things without a backbone, worms and shrimp and snails and all of this kind of stuff. We found two very strong groups. So below around 200 feet or 60 meters, we saw one group, and above around 45 meters or so, we saw another group. And so it was really exciting. This was a very strong pattern. And something like this had been looked at and had been seen before in a few places, not actually Hawaii, but it had been seen by counting corals or counting sponges or whatever. And this result was really exciting because it said, okay, well, maybe that pattern goes across a lot of different animals rather than just those few groups. And maybe something more general is going on the reef. And so this was kind of the preliminary work using this new technology on deep reefs specifically. And there's only been one or two other studies, that maybe only one, that have applied this technology on deep reefs, but they were doing it something a little bit different from me. So this was recent work that I did when I was working on my PhD here in Hawaii, and I thought it was a quite exciting result. But so ultimately, just to sort of bring it back together, I think that deep reefs are special, right? They're unique in a lot of ways. They're similar in a lot of ways to shallow reefs at all, but they have their own thing going on, right? But they are also uniquely threatened. So I didn't want to show you a picture of a threatened reef, so I just showed you a picture of a couple of fishes here. But they have their own problems. They share some problems as well, and I think they need to be included in the overall picture of what a coral reef is and how we conserve it, how we protect it, those sorts of things. And there's just so much left to explore. So I'll leave you with a couple little goofy pictures of me underwater, and I think I'll wrap it up there.
Oh, fantastic. Mykle, what a wild journey you get to go on. I'm going for my advanced open water, going down even like a third as deep as you're going in September. I can't wait. And I want to note for our classes, I mean, Mykle's at like the upper echelon of scuba divers, but if you want to get in the water at 8 years old, you can start on the path to this. So a lot of our classes today, Patty, bubble maker for young kids, 10 years old, you can be an open water diver. You can have the same certification I have. So you open up 70% of the world to yourself, and you have that skill. Yeah. And it's tantamount to magic to be able to.
And you don't have to live next to an ocean to do it either.
We actually, we had classes in Saskatchewan the other day. I'm like, even if you're in the middle of a continent, they have pools, they have quarries, they have lakes. Like, there's lots of opportunities to get involved with this. So no better message than that. Well, we are going to dive in with our Kahoot. 4 quick questions between our talk and Q&A, and then we're going to dive in with questions. Our Viola Desmond crew, Mr. Shannon's class, our YouTube audience. So please do get to the ready with your trigger fingers for some great questions. But Mykle, for you, because this might be your first Kahoot as well, the faster our kids answer, the more points they get. And what they win is our everlasting respect. Like, we wish we could give prizes.
I feel like they already have that from me.
Yeah. More respect, even more beyond everlasting.
All right. I'll make sure to save some.
That's funny. All right, let's dive in with our first question, folks. And if you want to give us hints when there's a few seconds to spare, feel free to lead us in the right direction. Coral is a plant, animal, stone, alien life form. I'm going to give you a hint. It's not number 4. But the base
I mean, there's some pretty crazy stuff going on in there, but it is from the planet Earth.
It is from the planet Earth, and most you got animals. So coral's really unique. It sort of has a stone skeleton that it creates behind itself. It's got plants or algae that sort of embed its tissues, but it is an animal related to jellyfish, same group. And our audience, you guys are on the ball. So Groovy Bear has our lead. This won't surprise you, Michael, but these aren't real names. As we go into question 2, I hope we all get this right. I gave this as like a gimme. All coral lies right near the surface. Shallow only coral. Maybe not. What's our theme? What's the name of the Kahoot? No, I want everyone to get this one right. I just wanted to drive this point home because it's something that, like, we've literally done programs on deep water corals before, and people don't know this. This is a very uncommon thing to know. So false is our correct answer. There's many deep coral. It's quite astonishing that that ecosystem exists, given its sort of linkage to the sun. But I'm so glad you especially highlighted the change in individual species from the shallow to deep reefs is really, really cool. I've never seen that before, so I appreciate it immensely.
There are also corals that live in very deep water with no sunlight at all. They're not doing the same thing, but they are there.
Question 3, why might deep reefs be more stable habitats than shallow ones? There's more than one answer for this one, so less affected by human
controversial question.
Yeah, less affected by glaciation in the past. Well, you know what? Those controversy people aren't here, hopefully. Maybe they will be. We'll get some really angry questions in the chat. So our answers are 1 and 2. And so, Michael, I've seen some of your work about this, and it's really interesting that, like, because they're deeper, they're not as affected by trawling. They're not as affected by temperature shifts. And when the Earth was a giant snowball, it didn't quite reach down that far. So I'm really, if you want to speak to this a minute before I go to question 4.
Yeah.
By all means.
Yeah, it's a controversial idea, but there is, so as you know, we have these cycles on the planet, right, where over tens of thousands of years, glaciers grow and then they retreat. And when the glaciers grow, the sea level drops because all that water gets locked up into the glaciers. And so if you think about, you know, the side of an island or a continent where the bottom slopes down like this, and you have, you know, the coral reefs up here, as the sea level drops, those coral reefs obviously have to drop in some way too. And so there's a question of, islands tend to have slopes like this, middle of the ocean islands have these very steep slopes, and then continents often have more shallow slopes like this. And there's questions of how quickly the reefs can keep up with those changes. And one of the things we think might be going on with deep reefs is that they're already adapted to these deeper, kind of steeper slope-like environments, and there's less of it to be wiped out when the sea level drops. So when we have a glaciation, there's some cases maybe where those deep reefs may be able to just move up and down the slope, whereas the shallow reefs may get wiped out and then have to recolonize when the sea level goes back up.
We will keep on your research over the next years to come, and there might be a Nobel in your future. We've had a few Nobel in our past, so we'll see how it goes. Groovy Bear is taken over by Captain Otter. Going into our final question: true or false? We've discovered every coral reef in the world. You talked about this with fish, and I love this. We had I forget her name right now. We brought on a scientist who had done many deep sea expeditions, and we asked how many species she'd found, and she said, I literally don't know. Like, it's like every time we go, we find new things.
Oh, especially in the deep sea, everything is brand new.
It's like tropical rainforest. If you go, you fumigate for bugs. If you go to the deep sea, you will always find a new species on new expeditions. It's quite amazing. Oh, yeah. That there's so much of the world we've yet to discover. And so many of you got this right. Lucky Wallaby second. First for all the marbles in that respect amount is, let's see, Captain Otter takes it from Groovy Bear. Thank you guys for participating, everybody. We are going to dive in with our questions. So Mr. Shaddis class in Deep River, if you guys want to kick us off 5-6s, you are good to go. Take us away. Guys.
If you step on a coral reef, would it hurt your foot?
Ooh, does it hurt your foot?
Yeah. In many cases, I think it would. It would also hurt the coral, though, because they can be quite sensitive to being touched like that.
I'm really
glad
it's
a rock, right? It's a spiky rock, and so if you step on it in the wrong way, it can. And there's lots and lots of bacteria. So if it cuts you, you can potentially get an infection. It's happened to me.
Avoid stepping on coral is our moral of the story. Yeah. And I'm so glad you took it that way. Also, for ship explorers, we do a lot of ship programs here. Ships avoid coral reefs like the plague.
Oh, yeah.
If you're a ship and you hit a coral reef, it will tear through the ship like a knife through butter.
I mean, they're stony. They're very hard. And as you can see, they're spiky. And you can break them off, but they're robust in many cases. So.
Robust corals, our theme of the day. We'll call the program that next time. Viola, Desmond, we're going to head to you guys. Unmute your mic and take us away. Hey, guys.
If coral gets damaged, can it grow back, and how long would it take to grow back?
Great question.
Great question. Yeah, so I mean, before I answer this, I just want to say I am not a coral scientist, but these are great questions, and I do know some of the answers to this. So corals can grow back. It really depends on what kind of coral it is, because there's thousands of different species, and they all kind of grow at different rates. They tend to mostly grow quite slow, though. So the sort of the bigger and the rounder the coral is, so if it's a big mound, they tend to be very slow growing. If they're these kind of little spiky guys, they grow a little bit quicker. I don't know the specific rates, but one of the things that happens that you see on a reef that is damaged, say a hurricane comes by or a boat crashes into it or something like that, is that the things that grow back first are all of these little, we call them weedy species, things that grow faster. And they tend to be these more upright things, the plate-shaped things, this kind of spiky things. And so it will grow, but it tends to grow quite slowly. And that's a problem in a world where the conditions for corals are changing, right? So if they are damaged, they want to grow back and they will try to grow back. But if the water stays too warm, or if the fishing pressure stays too high, the growing back will be quite a challenge.
I want to note, too, for our kids that are really keen on coral growth, we did a program back on April 12th with the Coral Resilience Lab in Hawaii, sort of getting coral
great.
head start. So
they know all about that.
Yeah, 2-year sort of head start for the coral to get them big enough that when they planted them, just like a tree is better when it's a sapling than as a seed. So if you want to learn more about that, that's on our YouTube channel. Really, really cool follow-up.
They are just down the hall from me.
Excellent. What a cool Hawaii. So lucky. You guys are amazing. Michael, we got a great question on YouTube. How has the technology increased to allow us to dive more deeply and safely? You highlighted a few really cool scuba technologies, but whether you want to extend that to submersibles or whatever, anything you can share about how we're exploring the deep sea a little more effectively now with our tech?
Yeah, there's a number of things. So like the rebreathers that I told you about is the thing that I'm personally quite excited about. And those are kind of the technology for that is evolving a lot. So one of the things that the rebreathers use is an oxygen sensor. So it's a little electronic gizmo that will measure the amount of oxygen. And that's very critical for your safety and your survival, right? It needs to know. And those little things for a long time, they're essentially based on a chemical reaction. And that is not always doesn't always give you an exact number. So usually you use 3 of these things and it decides based on the average or the best number from the 2 that are reading closest together. One great development in that area is that there's something now called a solid state oxygen sensor, which is essentially all electronic, and it can give you a much more exact reading, and it doesn't wear out the same way that the chemical sensors do. So that's a new kind of an exciting thing, which that oxygen measuring part is a really critical part of this system. Some of the other things that have been going on is there's a lot of work in people building, these remote operated vehicles, these little robots, but making them smaller and more compact and cheaper. So that, you for $1,000, you can buy something called an open ROV. That's a little robot that will go down to 100 meters if you force it, and can actually be very, really, really useful to scout out new environments without having to dive on them first. It can't necessarily collect things for you or catch fish or whatever, but it's a very great tool for sort of understanding what's going on before you dive in directly. And then of course in the deep sea, the much larger robots are always improving. I worked for a little while in a factory that built these very large undersea robots, and that technology is just really absolutely astounding. They can go down to 4,000 or 5,000 meters, and they're the size of a small Volkswagen bus.
Cool.
So.
There was literally a news article the other day about DARPA, so the U.S. military creating an amazing manta ray thing that's going to be exploring the deep sea very soon. We recently did a program with the Canadian Geographical Society featuring James Cameron's manned submersible. So so it's the golden age of exploring the sea. I can tell you through these broadcasts,
it really is.
There's more investment, research, amazing people like Michael doing really cool stuff. So if you're keen on this is like the time to be in. You kids are at the perfect time to be interested in all of this.
There's lots of billionaires out there trying to do ocean exploration.
There
nowadays.
sure are. We feature their ships all the time.
Yeah.
We've got time for just a few more questions. Time flies when you're having fun. I do want to note, if you guys want to check out the Our World Underwater Scholarship Society website, our remaining program, we've got one more to wrap up May. And the Story Collider is doing a live show in New York and not too long, June 2nd, I believe. So do check that out if you get the chance live or recordings after the fact. But let's take two more questions from our live groups before we wrap up. Mr. Shadow's class, come on back in. Hey, guys.
If a big school of fish swam by you, would they notice you?
Yes, but it depends on, so like I said, with the rebreathers, they tend to think you're kind of more part of the environment because you're not blowing these big noisy bubbles everywhere. If you were on scuba, like a regular scuba tank, they probably wouldn't swim kind of right over you. Whereas on rebreathers, they might kind of come towards you and just kind of go around you. So there's a real big difference, just the lack of bubbles makes in the behavior that you see of the animals around you. So they know you're there, but they don't look at you as, I think, the same kind of threat or the same kind of sort of alien invader when you're not blowing bubbles.
Thank you for that analogy. I like that very much. Viola, Desmond, if you guys want to wrap us up with one final question, just flick on your mic and come on in. We've got a few from YouTube as well. I know you guys have your devices off right now. Oh, there we are. Come on in and wrap us up. Hey, guys.
We've got one more question.
Perfect.
Why don't we just use satellite to see coral reefs?
Yeah, so why don't we just explore them from space?
Well, a lot of people are. There's a lot of really great work that's using satellites. The problem is that it's really hard to see through the water. So satellites are very, very good at seeing the top of the water, but any further down than maybe a couple of feet, it gets tricky. So there's no way to actually see what's under there because there's, the water itself absorbs too much light or it reflects too much light, and so you just can't see it. So you need to get down there some way, either put a person down there, put a camera down there, whatever you're going to do. There's a lot of great work that can be done with satellites, but in terms of understanding the system itself and the biodiversity, there's no substitute for being there in person.
Michael, that's a really fantastic answer. And I also want to give a kudos to the student for asking that. It's really hard to ask the professional, like, why do we even do your job? And so we don't get that very often. So both sides of that was great. Time flies when you're having fun. We are nearing the end of the broadcast. Is there any last message you want to leave our classrooms about the work that you do, ways that they can learn more or get excited? Anything to cap us off today, Michael?
Yeah, I think, a lot of people, and I think a lot of the speakers maybe in this series, you'll see people say, oh, once upon a time I found a dead fish on a beach and ever since then I knew I wanted to be a marine biologist. That's not necessarily my story. I grew up near the ocean and I was always fascinated by it, but my interest in this really didn't sort of coalesce until I was much older. And I didn't go to college kind of like a normal person. I went when I was older, and it was a lot of experience in the real world that kind of got me interested in this work. I worked as a technician on a research vessel, and I was always next to people doing science, but I was never the one personally doing it. And after a while of doing that, I realized that I wanted to know what was going on in the world, and I wanted to kind of understand some of those questions. And so that drove me to kind of go back to school and study this kind of stuff, and it brought me to where I am today. So I think you don't have to know what you want to be when you grow up. I think it's a really important piece of advice. It can come to you at any moment, and the thing that ends up being your passion does not have to have been your lifelong passion, I think.
Michael, that's a really fantastic message. And just by complete fluke, it's the third time we've had someone highlight something like that this week alone. We're like, really, 99% of people do. They knew what they wanted to do when they were really young. I'm one of those people. I'm lucky to be in that situation. But it's so nice to showcase that you can approach this in any way, shape, or form. And sometimes the experiences in your life will lead you in a completely different career path when you're older. So thank you very much for wrapping up that way. It's been a real pleasure having you. And what we do to wrap up every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our class and say a big thank you and farewell. They just lined up without me even telling them. Mr. Shadow's class, thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day, guys, and bye for now.
Thanks, guys.
Home. See you soon, everyone.